Welcome to The Crucible of Secession, a tactical analysis exploring the explosive opening engagement of the American Civil War. Set against a vintage coastal map of Charleston Harbor, this presentation centers on the pivotal moment that ignited a fractured nation. The dramatic visual features a stylized fort under siege, struck by a vibrant red artillery arc tracing the very first shots fired across the bay. Together, we will dissect the strategic choices, geographic conditions, and military maneuvers that defined this initial conflict between 1860 and 1865. Let us step back in time to analyze the spark that forever altered American history. In this tactical analysis, we examine why controlling the harbor ultimately dictated control of the entire region. Looking closely at the geography of South Carolina, we pinpoint the critical flashpoint: the state's secession on December 20, 1860, which triggered an immediate demand for the surrender of all federal facilities. This area quickly became a dangerous choke point. Because of the harbor's unique geometry, whoever held the central bastions, Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, wielded total authority over the region's maritime commerce and defense. As we view these concentric mileage rings surrounding the harbor, we see how geographic proximity transformed these stone forts into the ultimate strategic prizes of the early conflict. Let's examine the triad of Charleston Harbor defenses, a breakdown of the three federal installations anchoring the bay. First, Fort Moultrie, built in 1776 from palmetto log and brick. It serves as the Union headquarters for 85 troops but is highly vulnerable to landward infantry scaling due to shifting sand dunes. Next is Castle Pinckney, a circular brick fort from 1810, which remains a small, under-garrisoned secondary position with limited strategic dominance. Finally, we have Fort Sumter, begun in 1829. Boasting 50-foot-high, 5-foot-thick masonry on an artificial granite island, it is incredibly imposing yet critically unfinished, lacking mounted guns and occupied only by civilian construction workers as the crisis looms. Now, we look at Anderson's Midnight Gambit, a daring tactical maneuver executed on December 26, 1860. Realizing Fort Moultrie's vulnerability, Major Anderson ordered a scorched earth policy, spiking Moultrie's heavy guns and burning their wooden carriages to deny them to the Confederates. Under the cover of darkness, the crossing began. 85 men secretly rowed across the open channel in small boats, fully prepared to engage any hostile guard vessels. Their destination was Fort Sumter. By occupying this formidable island fortress, Anderson secured a strategic checkmate, outraging South Carolina authorities who swiftly seized the abandoned mainland forts, setting the stage for an inevitable military showdown. This brings us to the failed relief of the Star of the West. On January 9, 1861, an unarmed merchant ship bearing 200 reinforcements and vital provisions attempted to resupply the fort. However, South Carolina military cadets staffing a battery on Morris Island opened fire, forcing the vessel to retreat. This failed mission sealed Fort Sumter's absolute isolation. Cut off from all outside assistance, Major Anderson's garrison was left completely stranded. By April, the situation had grown desperate, with the men surviving on dwindling rations of salt pork and facing critical powder shortages, while surrounded by increasingly hostile forces dynamic across the harbor. Next, we examine how Beauregard constructs a ring of fire. Confederate Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, ironically, a former West Point student of Major Anderson, commands the total encirclement of Fort Sumter. He orchestrated an inescapable network of artillery positions focusing their crosshairs directly on the federal stronghold. From Fort Johnson on James Island, mortar batteries sit just 1.25 miles away. Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island stands ready with heavy 32-pounders and devastating hotshot furnaces. Out in the harbor, an armored floating battery armed with 32-pounders floats in position, while Cummings Point on Morris Island deploys the Iron Battery, alongside heavy 10-inch mortars, sealing the doom of the isolated fort. Let's evaluate the tactical imbalance, a stark comparison revealing the asymmetric reality faced by both sides. The United States garrison is critically outnumbered, holding only 85 men against roughly 500 active Confederate troops backed by 6,000 supporting militiamen. In terms of firepower, the Union possesses just 21 operational guns, restricted to lower tiers to avoid sniper fire. while the Confederates boast 43 heavy guns and massive 10-inch mortars. Logistically, the contrast is even more severe. Union soldiers are down to dwindling pork rations and 700 handmade gunpowder cartridges frantically sewn from socks and shirts, whereas the Confederate forces enjoy limitless local supply lines fully stocked directly from the city of Charleston. We now witness the moment. The spark ignites the harbor, charting the final countdown to open war. On April 11, General Beauregard issues a formal surrender ultimatum. Major Anderson refuses, grimly noting his men will soon starve anyway. In the early hours of April 12, at 3:20 a.m., Confederate aides reject Anderson's proposed delayed evacuation timeline, giving a strict 1-hour notice of bombardment. Then, at 4:30 a.m., the tension snaps. Lieutenant Henry S. Farley fires a 10-inch signal mortar from Fort Johnson, arching over the bay. Moments later, Edmund Ruffin fires the first Columbiad round to directly strike Fort Sumter's brick walls, signaling the violent dawn of the American Civil War. Let us examine the mechanics of the bombardment, analyzing the fatal design vulnerabilities of the fort. Inside the walls, the Union faced a severe tactical disadvantage. Major Anderson was forced to completely abandon the uppermost barbette tier, which housed his best guns, to protect his men from deadly overhead fire. The remaining Union guns, confined to the lower, enclosed, casemate tiers, critically lacked the necessary elevation to inflict serious damage. Meanwhile, the Confederates leveraged a massive advantage. Firing in a calculated counterclockwise sequence to conserve ammunition, their high-arcing mortars effortlessly bypassed the 5-foot-thick masonry walls, plunging explosive shells straight down into the fort's entirely unprotected open parade ground. Next, we explore Hot Shot and the Interior Inferno, highlighting the terrifying crisis that erupted inside Fort Sumter. The Confederates deployed a devastating weapon, Hot Shot, which consisted of solid iron cannonballs heated red-hot in mainland furnaces, specifically engineered to set wooden structures ablaze. As the fort's barracks and quarters quickly transformed into a raging inferno, a desperate internal crisis unfolded. Surrounded by suffocating smoke and encroaching flames, Union soldiers frantically crawled on their bellies to seal the massive doors of the main powder magazine. Their heroic efforts narrowly averted a catastrophic explosion of 300 barrels of gunpowder, saving the garrison from total annihilation amid the spreading fire. Welcome to Nailing the Colors to the Mast, a testament to defiance under fire. During the grueling 34-hour bombardment, Fort Sumter flew a smaller 10 by 20-foot storm flag, as the larger garrison flag had been torn by high winds. The defining moment of resistance came at 1 p.m. on April 13, when a Confederate shell shattered the main flagstaff, sending the colors falling. Refusing to allow the symbol of the Union to remain struck, civilian volunteer Peter Hart braved intense enemy fire. He retrieved the tattered banner, secured it to a long spar, and boldly re-hoisted it atop a parapet gun carriage, proving that while the fort was crumbling, its defenders' resolve remained unbroken. We conclude with Surrender and the Irony of Bloodshed, a striking paradox that marked the battle's end. After 34 hours of relentless combat, exhausted, starving, and entirely out of ammunition, Major Anderson accepted honorable terms of surrender at 2:30 p.m. on April 13. Remarkably, 0 men on either side were killed during the historic artillery bombardment itself. Yet, tragic irony followed. On April 14, during the final 100-gun salute to the American flag, Anderson's sole condition for withdrawal, an artillery piece prematurely exploded. The blast instantly killed Private Daniel Huff and mortally wounded Edward Galloway, recording them as the very first casualties of the Civil War, born not from enemy fire, but a fateful salute. We close our tactical journey with The Rubble Paradox, a fascinating look at the unintended consequences of total destruction. Over the course of 587 days, Union artillery battered the fort with 7 million pounds of metal, successfully reducing the grand 1861 third system masonry walls to absolute ruins. However, this relentless onslaught created an engineering irony. By 1864, the heavily pulverized and compacted rubble formed a superior, impenetrable earthwork that easily absorbed incoming cannon fire. Instead of clearing the path for victory, the ruins actually fortified the position, allowing Confederate defenders to stubbornly hold the island against multiple amphibious assaults, proving that destroying a fort could sometimes make it indestructible. Finally, we come to a grim chapter in late 1864 titled, Human Shields and the Immortal 600. In a brutal standoff driven by retaliation over prisoner treatment, 600 Confederate officers held as prisoners of war were placed in an open stockade on Morris Island, directly in the line of fire of Union artillery. Trapped in a terrifying crossfire, Union shells screamed constantly overhead toward Fort Sumter, forcing Confederate gunners on the island to aim high to avoid slaughtering their own men. Enduring starvation, rations, and constant exposure to deadly artillery fire, this resilient group endured the horrific ordeal, forever remembered in history as the Immortal 600. We conclude our journey with the tactical epilogue, analyzing the strategic fallout after 4 grueling years of war. On February 17, 1865, facing General Sherman's unstoppable advance through the South Carolina mainland, Confederate forces evacuated Fort Sumter without ever surrendering it under fire. This marked the dramatic Union return. On April 14, 1865, exactly 4 years to the day after his original evacuation, a newly promoted Brevet Major General Robert Anderson returned to raise the very same tattered storm flag over the ruined fort. This powerful moment of historical closure symbolized the restoration of federal authority, effectively closing the circle on the battlefield where the American Civil War first began.